Okay, folks. Welcome to the panel on AI and ethics, or ethics and AI. Oh, no, it is AI and ethics. It's a great privilege to talk about this. It's a very interesting topic that is on a lot of people's minds. We have a very exciting panel. I'm Ben Kuipers in computer science and engineering. Ella Atkins is in the Department of Aeronautical Engineering. Jagadish is in computer science and engineering, and Michael Wellman is also in computer science and engineering. And I think all of these people have opinions in these things. So I feel that we work here in artificial intelligence. And the scientific goal of artificial intelligence is to understand the nature of intelligence and, or more generally, the problem of mind, and to build computational models of the phenomena that we identify. Now, naturally, as we make technological progress, it becomes a natural goal to build artifacts, to build artificially intelligent agents that will help us out by making useful decisions about actions to take in the world. And these range across a whole wide variety of things. We heard early on about autonomous vehicles that can drive on our roads or fly through our skies. They can carry passengers, they can carry cargo. In Ella's case, they can even carry nail guns in order to nail shingles on the roofs or wherever they might want to go. I'm sorry, I'm just taking advantage of...
There's a safety that you have to push down to make the nail deploy.
Yeah, yes, it's a very safe, but...
My students did point it at me one day.
So you see, safety mechanisms have their limits. But there are also many data-driven systems that learn to recognize consumer preferences, human faces, your worthiness for credit or maybe bail, your tendencies towards criminal behavior, other kinds of things. And people are happily working on machine learning systems to build systems that will do this sort of thing. These raise questions. There's also high-speed trading systems that participate in our financial markets and that respond to changing market conditions at the millisecond speeds, leaving kind of the rest of us in the dust. So there is a questions start coming up about ethics. And ethics is clearly a good thing in some sense, but exactly what it is also an interesting question. So I'm using the term ethics to denote a certain body of human knowledge. And that knowledge is used to guide and constrain human behavior choices. So being a body of human knowledge, it's one of the kinds of things that AI experts might well want to study and represent and use in a computational system. Philosophical ethicists, moral philosophers, study this body of knowledge, but they're not the only people to do that. The definition under moral philosophy is systematizing, defending, and recommending concepts of right and wrong behavior. And so it's kind of studying the nature of that body of knowledge. So let me state my personal position on these questions, on what ethics and what ethical knowledge is. So first, individuals make action decisions. So each of us makes action decisions for one reason or another, and we've heard a bunch of things just recently about reinforcement learning and reward systems and so forth. But it's important to recognize that individuals live and act in the context of a society, and actually maybe of many societies. Over the period of time of human evolution, people lived in many small societies. and therefore interactions both within the group and with outsiders to the group were particularly important and were often quite different. Cooperation among members of a society produces positive sum results. And that gives the society more resources, making it stronger. Individuals in that society obviously benefit from the strength of their society. But also, if you have zero-sum or negative-sum interactions, exploitation and so forth, it makes the society weaker. So this puts cooperation at a central point in how societies thrive or not. And cooperation depends on trust. So I'm going to have trust as a very central concept in all of this. It's trust that collaborators, people you're cooperating with, will do their share of the work. Trust that if you do collaborate on something, that the fruits of the collaboration will be shared in a reasonably fair way. And there's trust of many, many other things. The kind of ethical principles and the kinds of trust in a society are very complex and varied. Ethical knowledge, including social norms, show members of society how to be trustworthy, how to show to other people that they are good potential cooperative partners. Now, nowadays, I sort of appealed to the period of human evolution where you had small bands of people who really depended very intensely on each other, and they might compete intensely with other small bands. Nowadays, we live in a very complex world, and each of us belongs to a number of overlapping societies. So we are in academia, we are citizens of various countries, we belong to different professional groups. The success or failure of a society depends in part on how well its members can trust each other, and hence how well they can cooperate to meet the challenges and opportunities that might be faced by that society. So in the historical context, a small group that could cooperate well would tend to capture more food, would tend to share it more equitably, and would be able to defend themselves against attack better than ones who wouldn't be able to trust each other. In our modern society, it may turn out that having a shared ethic of concern for the environment and its impact on future generations could actually turn out to be critical for the survival of our society. So here's a picture where we have trust, cooperation, and ethics. And what I'd wanted to do is to understand what the function of this is. So now finally we get to AI. And if it turns out that we're creating artificially intelligent creatures that are going to participate as if they're members of our human society, then arguably ethics should constrain their behavior too, just as it does ours. So what I'd like to ask the other members of the panel to comment, although this is sort of a free-form start, is to say, from your perspectives, what activities by AI systems need to be ethically guided and constrained? What do we need to trust? How should ethical knowledge be represented and learned? In humans, a lot of ethical knowledge is learned by being told. I mean, you learn it from your parents, you learn it from other people who teach it to you. How can we ensure that ethical guidance and constraints are actually followed? So what I'm going to do, these are enormous questions. So I'm going to give each of you 8 minutes. and make whatever comments you feel inspired to, and then I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience, and then we'll discuss that for the remaining time we have. Hello.
So 8 minutes is actually quite a long time if you're sitting here and thinking about crisp, clean answers to these questions as opposed to rambling statements. So I'm not sure I'm going to offer the crisp, clean answer, but that's the goal. I'm going to connect what I discussed to what I have paid attention to a bit in my community, which are the regulations, the law, liability associated with autonomous vehicles, specifically air vehicles. So when you frame the questions that Ben asked, the first one, this is my cheat sheet of questions, what activities by AI systems should be ethically guided and constrained? The easiest mapping is to go, in my field, to the federal aviation regulations and their application to aircraft, airmen, airspace, and making sure people interact effectively. And when I say people, that was the people who are on the airplane, the pilots, the air traffic controllers, the dispatchers, and mechanics, and so forth. So in that world, which was very human-centric and still is today, we assume that people value their jobs, and so we require a system by which both the job description and the oversight by management requires following rules. These rules tend to be written down, and the cleaner and more complete the rules are, the more likely it is that the person is doing their job. So for example, with air traffic control, we have very strict schedules. How long can a human sit in front of a screen with high pressure decisions involving air traffic? Looking at little blips on the radar, translating voice input that they receive from pilots, many pilots potentially in a very complex airspace, and translating that into commands of vectoring aircraft, sequencing aircraft, telling them when to divert, and occasionally handling emergencies. So what's been found over the years is that that is a high-stress job, so the shifts have to be relatively short. There needs to be a manager looking over the people to make sure that no one is beginning to lose the picture and relieving them temporarily if they do. So now if we imagine an AI taking over that role, and one of the reasons that I bring up that specific example is that I think that is next. And it doesn't mean that we'll have a great reduction in jobs. It means that we're going to be shifting from jobs in which a human stares at a screen, listens to voice, and makes routing decisions to a job where a human data analyst, or perhaps a whole group of them in a room, will analyze, not necessarily even in real time, all of the data that comes in from all of the different types of aircraft and makes long-term decisions on how to change routings, priorities, et cetera. So what would be ethical there? Well, if we're guided by the regulatory process, then thing number one would be to make sure that the data was correct, that you didn't take in bad streams of data from perhaps an aircraft sensor that wasn't working properly, or if you did, that there was some oversight, perhaps by software, that was able to detect that that data was not correct and make sure that it doesn't maintain a presence in future maps. Now that's kind of a boring example because that's not the human equivalent AI. But yet if you look at how people work today in sectors such as aviation, you don't really want general intelligence to play an everyday role in vectoring aircraft, or even on board, where your goal really is to very methodically follow a set of checklists for every phase of operation, and to only do something clever if the system, whether it's the aircraft, the environment, or the information that you get through the radios or your instruments, is so severely challenging that none of those procedures apply. But there are a lot of procedures. So then, what does that mean? That means that the activities that should be ethically guided and constrained in aviation are pretty much everything. All right, well, that sounds pretty daunting and limiting. What about that person that just wants to go out and have a good time? What if they have an autonomous aircraft? When should it flip them upside down? Well, maybe not right after lunch. But now it would be okay, right? It's been a few hours. When should a drone fly over the White House or the stadium on game day? Well, probably never. But what if the human wants it to? Should it say no? Should it have the ability to say no? Well, so I guess if you take the regulatory perspective, then whether it's the laws of the university, the laws of the FAA, the laws of the state of Michigan, or some other body, then if we respect those as being the ethically correct thing to do, sometimes we do, I think, and sometimes we kind of don't want to, then that plane should say no. It should say, I'm not flying over the stadium. There's 100,000 people there, right? Even if we want it to. But I assure you that right now, there are all kinds of people out there that don't recognize the connection between regulatory constraint and a desire to do what's fun. At least in the drone world, what I've seen is that if you're flying it yourself, you think there's no problem. You should be able to do whatever you want. And I think that goes for driving too, right? You know, who needs to obey the speed limit, right? If you're driving 80 on Michigan roads and the speed limit is 70, you think things are fine. But then if the weather turns south a little bit, or for whatever reason you're not at 100% and somebody goes zipping by you on the freeway, you're like, wow, that's a really reckless driver. When maybe just yesterday you were driving that fast yourself. Well, so what do you do with the AI then? Do you tell the autonomous car that it should be able to go 90 in a 70 zone? Or do you put a governor on it? And I'll tell you, way back when I was in college, we drove long distances to do experiments, and I had a friend who I learned how to disable governors on budget rental trucks. Maybe that was a bad idea, but anyway, it let us go really fast, going where we wanted to go. So anyway, even if you're writing simple AI to follow regulatory requirements, there are still open questions in how do you make it do what you want while it's following the rules, because we don't always follow those rules. And then finally, how can we ensure that ethical guidance and constraints are actually followed? Well, I guess today that's the job of the police, whether it's campus, local, anything else, or the Good Samaritan that happens to come by and say, wait a minute, he's being a good Samaritan because he's telling me I only have 1 minute. I'm not sure that's ethical. So I think there's a challenge in enforcement. It's one thing to fine an individual and say, hey, you have a $50 parking ticket, a $100 speeding ticket, you're going to spend a week in jail because you were under the influence of some substance, whatever it is. There's a kind of accepted punitive process by which humans have acknowledged that they're okay, going along with. I don't know how to punish AI, right? I mean, do you put it in a corner? What does it even mean, right? Maybe if it's physically instantiated in a robot, you can say, I'm going to shut you down for 3 days. But does it really feel remorse when you turn it back on? I don't know, maybe some of you are working on that, but I haven't really done that yet. So those are open questions.
Okay, so I think that it's great fun to sort of philosophize about very intelligent AI systems that might someday come to be, or that people in this room believe will come to be. And when they have these human-like powers and they can reason through things and have conscience and so on, then we can talk about the ethics of such AI systems. I'm going to talk about a much more limited notion of AI in terms of there being an agent with some limited capabilities that a human is willing to delegate a task to. And so I'm not going to assume any morality or any ethical reasoning on the part of the agent directly. The responsibility is of the person deploying the agent. And yes, when you delegate a task, you might also delegate certain constraints on how that task is to be performed. So just to begin some disagreements to make the panel fun, I'm going to say that once you start from that perspective, you're never going to have an AI system that declines to do something the way Ella was talking about it. Okay, there might be a reason that I want to speed. You know, I've got somebody's really sick and I need to rush them to the hospital. And the risk that I pose to myself and to other drivers is something that I decide as a human is something that I want to do. And it's for me to balance the ethics of that and not for some pre-programmed governance system to stop me. Okay. If the human is responsible for the deployed agent, the question becomes, how does the human make sure that the agent performs within the realm of what the human would like the agent to do? And in many situations, there's enough time for this to happen. And indeed, the way that we have intelligent systems deployed today in many situations, say in a medical situation or in a legal situation, we have systems that perform certain analysis, come up with certain recommendations, but the ultimate decision is made by a human expert. I think that there are longer-term issues here, and there are questions about how much the human expert, who's a domain expert, understands the basis for the recommendation and how they're able to either accept or override the recommendation. I think there are many issues of concern there in terms of explainability, but at least we have time enough for the human to take responsibility. I think that if you're a pilot and you've got 4 seconds to decide whether you're going to turn around or fly a different route and try to land on the river, you probably don't have enough time to override a decision if there's a recommendation. So then it becomes a much trickier situation of how do you get meaningful recommendations from an intelligent something that the pilot is able to react to in time. And I really don't know what the answer is to that, because there's a question of what's been delegated. Is the entire flying of the aircraft delegated to the intelligence system? Or is it a recommendation system, in which case the pilot is still responsible and needs to have the human time constants to respond to it? I also want to address the issue of trust. There is no bug-free software system. And we have to assume that AI systems will fail from time to time. And part of the definition of a bug is that it was something that we didn't expect. And so these failure modes are frequently going to be surprising. They're unanticipated, that's why they're there. And since we as humans sort of have some understanding of typical human failure modes, and we have a much weaker understanding of software failure modes, I think that it's going to be many centuries before we have enough experience with AI systems that we will be able to develop trust in them enough to know how they might fail and what we might do when they fail. My final point is, often when we have these discussions, and in fact, the bulk of what we've been talking about in the past 20 minutes has been sort of responsibility and ethics in the local. We're worried about the actors themselves and the situation right there. I think that there are systemic issues to consider, and this is a large part of sort of the ethical responsibility of developing technology. And that is something that we shouldn't forget about. There is a lot of scholarship, for instance, on the future of work. And that's, you know, in terms of how automation does things there. But I haven't seen a lot of scholarship, for instance, on how traffic, you know, we need to understand, well, actually, let me back up. So for example, let me just talk about one example. So if you say you're developing automated vehicles, in addition to thinking about how to make the vehicle work better, you also need to understand what that does to traffic patterns and parking patterns. And so one should expect, if one goes from human-driven vehicles to automated vehicles, that parking becomes less valuable and driving around on streets becomes a more common action. And if you want to counteract that, you have to think about what your systemic things will be in terms of how you do pricing of presence on the street in a city. And one needs to have thought about these things as well. I'm going to stop here and hand it off to Michael.
Okay, thanks. So I'm just going to make a few points related to AI and ethics, but let me start just by introducing where I'm coming from on this topic. I've been an AI researcher for many years. My area is multi-agent systems. I do work on the boundary of AI and economics, and so think very much about what are the incentives and motivations for decisions that one makes when one is in a system or a society with other agents who are also making decisions, and how you predict what they're going to do. That's relevant both if you are an AI or an agent, or if you're just if you are a third-party analyst who's designing systems that will involve those agents. I think that a lot of the kind of decision making is being and will be automated. I study various areas where that's happening, and the one that I've been focusing on lately is finance. Finance is really an amazing domain to look at because it is simultaneously the leading edge of autonomous systems. Algorithmic trading has taken over the volume of activity on most financial markets in a very quiet way over the past decade or so. Because of the superhuman response time that Ben alluded to, that has made it impossible to keep humans in the loop. And I said it happened quietly because no one decided to allow that to happen or did things in particular to enable it. Systemically, it just happened. And there's various reasons to think that it could matter for good or ill. So I said simultaneously. So simultaneously, it's the area where there's lots of AI. Increasingly, AI is involved in making decisions about credit for consumers, for small business, maybe large business, which is another area that people have been concerned. The simultaneous part is it's also one of the most fragile sectors of our economy, and I know there's a lot of young people here, but about 10 years ago, we had a major financial crisis that cost society trillions of dollars in productivity, plus lots of lives that were really derailed by that. Despite that there was no natural disaster, it was just a disconnect in this fragile information system, which is the financial system of a modern capitalist global economy. So it's a great area to be studying, and it's an area where it really makes clear that AI is going to matter, and the social implications are very high stakes. Okay, so now about ethics. It would be great if we could, I'm in favor of ethics. Let me put that on the table there. But you might expect that to be coming. I have quite a lot of doubt about whether the ethical frame is the most effective way to promote pro-social AI behavior in this domain and others. Here's why. So Ben several times referred to ethics as informing and guiding, or guiding and constraining human behavior. I don't think that really happens. I think that individual humans have their own ethical sense, and that's done. I'm not sure that the evidence that reasoning about ethics has led to significant constraint on matters of great social import. An example that Ben mentioned was the environment and climate. I'm not putting my bets on ethical wokeness to solve that problem. Actually, I'm not sure where to put my bets on that problem. What are the alternatives? Well, things that were mentioned. Jag mentioned trust. I have my doubts there too, because it's true. I agree with what Jag said, is that that the conditions to have trust in these systems are going to be very hard to meet. I just don't think that's going to be a barrier to adopting those systems. The systems I mentioned in finance, we don't trust them. Why should we? In fact, you say it's really amazing that we don't trust them, but yet we are giving them access to our wallets, or at least big companies and hedge funds are doing that. Very high stakes. They could lose, and it has happened a few times where tens of millions of dollars have disappeared because of some mistakes. But on average, it works, and so it gets adopted. And I think that's the way of a lot of technology. Ella spent a lot of time talking about regulation and law, and there certainly are quite limits too. I think, though, that's the only place, at least in the short run, to place our bets, is the institutions that we have that actually do guide and constrain human behavior. Again, whether or not you believe in them, there is force behind them, and there are other reasons in participating in an orderly society that we agree in a social contract to go along with it. And I think that reasoning or talking on that plane also avoids us from going into all the philosophical rabbit holes that one will necessarily get into when one is framing it in ethical terms. There's a big branch of AI. I think we saw a nice graph or cartoon graph of papers on fairness over the years. That's a real cottage industry. That's because it's a great thing to yak about like, is this what we mean by fair? Is that what we mean by fair? Again, if we want to wait till we have total agreement about that, we're going to have a lot of unfair systems out there. So, however, what we can do is we can say, well, look, we can have certain policies that this is what you're allowed to do in the system and this is what you're not allowed to do in the system. We can accept that even though we don't agree that's exactly the optimal rule. We don't have we don't have to agree with it philosophically. We could just agree with it practically that this is an effective constraint that we're all better off if we all adopt than as opposed to if none of us adopt it or if we all don't adopt it. Whereas, I think it's a worthy thing to be having these other discussions, but I view that as kind of the offline complement to the legal political work of regulating our systems in ways that we expect to be pro-social.
There we go. It would be fun to start a discussion among us who are up here, but I think it would probably be more exciting and productive to invite you guys to ask questions and get some answers from the members of the panel.
Does it work? Oh, yes. I have a question on the last comment that you made, which I found interesting. I share your impatience with algorithmic fairness as a field, and I agree there are too many papers. But what do you, which is not to say the field has no value, I just agree there's a lot and we need to make real world decisions. Can you give us an example of like a principle that you think everyone would agree on? Because I'm not sure, it's kind of hard for me to think what those principles might be. There's so much disagreement.
So I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's a good question. I don't actually think that we have too many papers necessarily. I'm just saying that that's a reflection of that it's going to take a while before this all gets sorted out. And I think actually this activity in computational fairness is actually going to be very productive and ultimately will inform the regulation. I think that we have an existing base of discrimination law that is a starting point, and it has, since that law, and of course many other categories of law, were made for a world where it was humans making decisions, not machines, they're the wrong things. So probably the highest priority thing is to try to patch those laws in the ways that gets rid of the ready loopholes that we see. So rather than seek the kind of the perfect conception that we want to have, let's look at where we can anticipate clear violations and cut off the gross ones. That's the kind of attitude I would take. Another area that I study in finance lately is market manipulation, which is just a kind of fraud that is endemic of many other kinds of fraud. I think in a lot of our legal systems, there's a big fraud loophole, because a lot of fraud law is based on intent. And AI makes it a little bit easier for promulgators of fraud to get plausible deniability of their intents. So I think there's some key things that if we were serious about it, we would say, let's not find the perfect conception of the right ethical principle and fix the glaring holes.
Now, I don't think that we're holding up waiting to get a perfect ethical code before making progress. So let's see. You've got the microphone, then after that you.
So actually, I want to interject just a moment on this. I think that there are lots of issues on which we can agree. I think that fairness happens to be one of those which is very difficult for people to agree on in terms of a formal definition. On the other hand, if one says, is this fair to a particular instance, we could probably, in many instances, get everybody in the room to agree, and there'll be only a small set of things near the boundary where one wouldn't. So not having a definition is different from not having a sense of what is fair and what is unfair. And I think that this kind of, a large space of examples or situations in which we all know what the right thing is and agree on what the right thing is dominates. And my go-to example for how societal consensus with regard to what is ethical changes societal behavior is spam. When it started out as a marketing innovation. It was a technological innovation. The first spammers set out, made money. They were lawyers, and then they gave up their law practice and made money as consultants on, unsolicited commercial email marketing. And they were successful at doing that. Okay. Today, there is spam, but it is controlled, and it is universally derided. And to me, that is ethical consensus. And I think that there are many more of these that we can find and we should.
Go ahead.
I wanted to ask about warfare. I know some time ago, Google had this internal rift because the company was working on an AI that would allow military drones to detect humans. And so there was a camp that said this is patriotic, this is defending the country, and then there was a camp that said this is allowing machines to control whether a human lives or dies. And I'm actually kind of a history nerd, so something that is consistent throughout the history of warfare is that if there's technology, it's going to get used, regardless of what the ethical convention on it is, except for like nukes. So like, for example, in World War I, Germany used poison gas on Allied soldiers, despite it violating war conventions. And the Allies protested, but once they saw Germany wouldn't stop, then the Allies started using poison gas as well. So how do you think AI would play in this sort of conversation on war ethics?
Okay, this has been a topic I've been thinking about for quite a while. For one thing, there are quite a few examples of technologies that have been banned and successfully banned. Now, successfully doesn't mean with 0 violations. So in World War I, poison gas was used quite a bit. After that, it was banned. That ban has been largely successful, with a few probably not huge, but very dramatically criticized exceptions, like in Iraq or a few other places. And so some of these bans have been really quite successful. I think some people argue that having robot soldiers would make it possible to embody the laws of humane warfare in their knowledge representation, and therefore you would have soldiers who wouldn't commit war crimes. Some of us are skeptical about the ability to actually do that in terms of both the perceptual ability and the cognitive ability to capture the necessary concepts. Another concern is that automated weapons are likely to be a very destabilizing technology, and that they're going to be they would be a technology that would be easily taken over by terrorist organizations, non-governmental organizations of various sorts, and could be unleashed in a variety of ways that would be, unlike traditional warfare, would be very hard to attribute to particular state entities that could then be retaliated against. So there's a group that put out a short movie called Slaughter Bots, and if you're interested in this, I would do Google it and watch that movie. It's just a few minutes long, but it's quite impactful. So one can think about larger scale questions about whether violence is an appropriate way for states to settle their conflict, but that's another matter.
So I'm not a fan of the Slaughterbots movie, as you know.
Yes.
There's a lot of drama. Now, anytime you have warfare of any sort, whether it's against one or a large number of people, there's always drama. But I remember last time we co-taught the ethics for robotics class. Please, if you're a student, take the ethics class this winter. Anyway, I needed to get that in at some point.
Yes, absolutely.
In that video, it shows drones going into a classroom much like this, maybe a little smaller, and opening fire. And it's a very powerful image, because any parent who looks at it is like, wow, I don't want those things on my college campus. And any student who looks at it, in fact, right now I'm looking at the exit doors going, are the drones out there? Are they ready to come in? Now, I think my response to that, after a long discussion of how bad that was, is, well, you know, if somebody wanted to be violent, all they really needed to do is to get a manned airplane and put some stuff in it and drop it on the building. Right? We already know how to kill people. Is it really different when you take drones and put weapons on them than when you drop a bomb on the building? Well, the same thing happens. People die. So I think the question is, how do we go down a path as we navigate our future of having disagreements between groups and trying to do the best we can to minimize at least collateral damage? And I don't mean fancy buildings. I mean collateral damage to people who really were not directly in the middle of the conflict accepting the fate that they might die during that conflict. One of the things, if you look in history, is airplanes. You know, I'm always going to talk about airplanes. We went from a time where we had people on the front line that knew they had a really good chance of dying every time they went into battle, to people over countries in fighter aircraft and bomber aircraft recognizing that they were almost certainly going to live because they were high enough and far enough away and fast enough that when they released their payload, that payload would probably harm a lot of civilians as well as people who were directly under attack. And they did it anyway, and they had, in many cases, a lot of trauma because they really didn't feel good at night after they did that. So now we could take that same weapon and send it in without a human. So we're already there. We know how to do that. So it's kind of funny that we see little puny drones with guns when we already have drones that carry weapons into combat right now with DoD. So the thing that's fascinating to me is, why does it matter whether Google does it or whether a company that regularly is a contractor for the Department of Defense does it? The difference is we notice.
So thanks for bringing up autonomous weapons. I think it's really hard to talk about ethics in AI without that being very high on the list of concerns. I think in warfare, it's hard to draw sharp ethical lines, that you feel totally comfortable or not. But I think there's a plausible way to argue that what autonomous weapons could constitute is a new category of weapons of mass destruction. And the real danger is that it makes it much cheaper for less organized entities to get a hold of ways to kill massive numbers of people at once. And that there's at least a plausible path by which the major powers of the world could realize that this is not an advantage for them, and some kind of ban could be in their interest. And of course, as Ella said, the cat's out of the bag. It's not that the knowledge for doing it is hard, but at least if you could get major defense contractors to not mass produce them and sell them cheaply, that does reduce the probability that they get out and in easy use. I would not have much hope that in the current United States administration that would be a conclusion that would be made, but perhaps in the next one.
So I wanted to also connect back to what you said in the context of the weapons, right? One of the reasons, in very serious terms, that autonomy needs to override human decision-making on airplanes is 9/11. It's a simple problem to solve with autonomy. There's never a reason to fly an airplane into a building. There just isn't. We have a system now available on many military aircraft called AUTO-GCAS, Automatic Ground Collision Avoidance System. It has a map of buildings as well as terrain. It was intended to save fighter pilots who try to fly under the radar. It has a dual purpose use to save planes from flying into terrain of any sort. It doesn't matter whether they're military or commercial or private. But we don't have it on any of our airplanes. It's because we largely, as a society, have held the notion that human pilots should be able to do whatever they want to, including fly into buildings, and several years later, German wings fly into a mountain, and even more recently, a pilot in Malaysia decided to fly out into the ocean and never come back.
Next question.
I think it would be interesting to look at a specific example of the Boeing 737 MAX 8. And I thought about that problem a lot. And it seems to me there are a couple things that you can see there. First of all, it doesn't seem to me that that problem was due to a software bug. It was rather flaws in the basic system design. The system was designed in a certain possibly threatening situation to take over control of the aircraft. But nobody's thought to put limits around that to say, no matter what the circumstances are, you should not fly the aircraft straight down into the ground. That was the first design flaw. The second design flaw is to make it so it was impossible for the human pilots to take over control from the system. That, it was just too strong for them. And the third was not really considering what's going to happen if the sensors fail, and really having some kind of backup strategy for what happens when the sensors fail. So how could we apply that principle to a lot of other situations?
Yeah, so let me encourage you to download the preliminary report, which is available online. You can actually zoom in and look at the black box data traces and see what happened on both of the flights. So one of the things that you see on the Ethiopian flight, and I've done that obviously, is you see a combination of mistakes. I totally agree with you, there were system level problems, and I think that's why the vehicle is still not flying today. Right now in commercial transport aircraft, safety critical systems have to be triply redundant. That particular system relied on one sensor, right, an angle of attack sensor, and for whatever reason, even though they had an additional angle of attack sensor, it wasn't comparing. So that was a problem of both the manufacturer and the FAA. The second thing was, after the first accident, in my opinion, it was more likely that the pilots wrote the instructions on how to recover than the engineers. And the implication of that was that, to be quite honest, I think the instructions were misleading. And misleading is the term that I'll use in a public space. So what that meant, what that means is that the crew of the second aircraft that crashed were following procedures, for the most part, that weren't actually addressing the problem in the best way possible. So they also made a mistake in the second accident in that they left the throttle at 100%. You can see it in the data. So the whole story about them not being able to manually trim the tab on the aircraft was because they had a much larger aerodynamic load, because they made the mistake of leaving throttle at 100%, which means they were going too fast. So there are all kinds of ways to fix it. But I think the bottom line is that was not AI, that was not even a new technology, it was a misdesigned technology. So I think where the media kind of got it a little bit wrong was in saying something about there being this brand new technology. The reality is the pilots could override it, they just didn't have the instructions on the proper way to do it.
But even if that wasn't AI, you could imagine something that is an AI being employed in a way that would have the same kind of.
So I will tell you that the basic fly-by-wire flight management systems have been in aircraft for 30 years now. And to my knowledge, there has not been a single accident that has been because of that software failing, absolutely. There's almost always a combination of environment, system failure, human failure, and they work together to make the most spectacular and terrible accidents.
So actually, in a similar vein, I have a question about, Jack, I think you mentioned that the ethics of this being related to a human delegating a task to an agent or to a robot. In the presence of information asymmetry, let's say the robot knows more than the human does and is either unable to communicate it or unable to communicate it in time. Information that if the human knew, the human might actually change their mind about what they wanted to do. So that's the first given. A second given being imperfect sensing and actuating of robots and humans. Neither are perfect, and there are basal rates of failure for both systems. At what point in the safety mindset, at what point does it become unethical to not have the robot take over and reject what the human is asking to do?
So I think this is where there may be a line, and I think Ella was arguing there should be one, and I would say that it's a slippery slope that once we start down, we'll end up giving up too much and not realizing what we're giving up. And so I would say, yes, there are probably situations where one needs to do this in terms of delegating responsibility completely and sort of saying, well, the agent knows better than me. But I would say it needs to be very circumscribed, very situational for things that have been carefully thought through. I don't know a lot about how aircraft sense buildings ahead of them, but I'd worry about a sensor failure that a human might override because they have other things. And if it's a triple sensed building, it's that kind of thinking through that would be required before one does that.
Well, let's say in the world where both will fail, right? The machine will fail, the human will fail. Is it just simply a matter of lines of reliability? Right? If the machine fails, let's say half as much as the human fails, are we as a society still willing to accept a car killing a person at half the rate that a person would kill the person, but still at a non-zero rate?
Yeah, so this is the whole, autonomous vehicles are better drivers than human drivers, and I think that they typically are, and I'm not a Luddite. But I think that the delegation is, so I'm perfectly happy sitting in a car and having the autonomous vehicle drive for me. But that's a conscious choice that I made because I said, hey, you're a better driver than me, take over. And I've delegated it in that situation. And if something happens, I need to be responsible. I need to understand what I did when I delegated.
Well, let me pick an example in the autonomous driving domain, that if you're about to cross a street and an autonomous car pulls up to the pedestrian walk, it's very important for you to be able to know whether you're prepared to trust that car to have seen you and to be prepared to pause while you complete your trip across the street. Now, so I think there's a situation where you have an autonomous system that is making autonomous decisions about how to act. So it's being delegated the ability to take you from A to B, from home to work or wherever, but the decisions in between are decisions that it is making autonomously, and the people around it need to be able to trust that it has the perceptual and the cognitive capability of doing the right thing there. Now, one of the examples that I find particularly distressing is, I think it was a Tesla, but it might not have been, but there was a while ago that one of the cars was speeding down an interstate and slammed into a stopped emergency vehicle. And it turns out that there are a lot of false positives that come back from your radar from things that have zero relative velocity to the ground. And so they had just classified those potential obstacles as all false and just ignored them. Now, this is obviously a design flaw that can be corrected, and so fortunately, I don't think anyone was killed in that particular accident, but it was obviously a difficult situation. But hopefully, it'll not happen again. So at what point I think what we are achieving by improving that technology, and we will have to do this for the pedestrian crossing case as well, is making sure that people can genuinely trust these vehicles to see them.
Yeah, I think autonomous driving is an area to feel most optimistic about for several reasons. One is that there is already a significant legal system and liability system that is in place, and there's a concentration in a few major motor vehicle manufacturers that has a strong incentive to get all this sorted out. Again, not in legal regulatory matters. There's also a lot of there's going to be, it's much easier for an autonomous vehicle actually to tell me as a pedestrian that they see me than it is for a driver in a car. In principle, they don't yet, but they but they actually can have flashing lights and to send messages. They could, in principle, they could do a much better job of communicating to the other vehicles around them and the other pedestrians than we currently have. So, ultimately, I think there's reasons in that domain that'll be there. So I think up front, we really should be thinking, again, not like sort of what the ethical thing to do is, but what is the accountability measures? How come do we have black box rules yet about when there are the accidents that will happen, that there are secure, auditable streams of what the car observed and believed at the time that the incident happened. Those are the things that I think are unambiguously important to try to do now.
Yeah, so I wanted to say, I think that's something that actually is another question of ethics-related proportion, is how much of this data that's being collected needs to be public? Because there are lessons learned, for example, by Tesla right now that need to be shared among all of the industry in terms of examples that were very hard for sensors that are industry-wide. Now, I think that people who actually consider that data to be of great value would shudder when I say that. Right? I talked to Boeing about their maintenance data, and they looked at me and they said, "This is how we make our money." Right? We don't make money selling airplanes, certainly not right now, but we make money on our maintenance data. So where is this kind of trade-off between having an open set of data that allow everyone to build the best products possible and the safest products possible versus keeping it close at hand so that you can sell it for more money? And I think that's hard. The other thing I want to say is I think if you go back 10 years, I would have sworn that autonomous planes would come before autonomous cars because it's so much easier to fly a plane autonomously than it is to drive a car. You're never going to see pedestrians, maybe birds, but not pedestrians.
Yeah, right.
Right, so it's really fascinating. I think it's a lot of psychological and societal issues that we face here in terms of the difference between driving and flying that are making the flying go a lot slower towards autonomy.
I would like to make one remark, and we've sort of run out of our time, but that I think it's important to consider the relationship between law and ethics. I mean, law and regulation and ethics. That we don't behave well just because there are laws and penalties. That the laws and penalties do provide punishments, but they also inform us of what good behavior is, of what our society expects of us. And if we only decided not to do antisocial things because of the risk of getting caught, the risk of getting caught is actually relatively small, and we would be in a lot more trouble. So what happens is that people decide, I am going to live a relatively law-abiding life. I might drive a little faster than 65, but but in general, people have personal ethical standards, and I think the functioning of society depends on people having those standards. Now, I think we have run out of our time. I'd like to thank you all for participating in this, and then I'd like to turn it over to Radha.